Welcome to Neurotypical's Don't Juggle Chainsaws, the podcast that cuts through the rubbish to explore the world of neurodiversity. I'm your host, Nic King.
And I'm your host, Kate Fox. And together we're here to explore, understand and celebrate being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. From ADHD and autism to dyslexia and other quirky brains, we talk about it all.
And go off on tangents. So whether you're neurodivergent, love someone who is, or you're just curious about neurodivergent minds, you are in the right place.
Let's get ready to juggle some words and maybe even a few chainsaws, metaphorically, of course. Hello and welcome to the podcast, Neurotypicals Don't Juggle. They don't juggle.
They don't juggle. They don't juggle.
There's not an juggle. There's not enough juggling in the world. Well, we could continue from here. Maybe we'll edit this out, or maybe we'll not. I'm a stand-up poet. Usually, I can pronounce words, not always. And I am with Nic King, and we're going to talk a little bit more about ourselves actually in this episode, because we're looking at diagnosis of autism and ADHD, and we're looking at self-diagnosis as well, and self-identification, as well as the official and arcane process that one might have to go through in order to get an official one. So, Nic, diagnosis.
So what if I officially I have autism, I'm autistic, and officially I am dyslexic. And that was my first one. I got dyslexic in my mid to late teens. So in terms of identification, I've always identified as neurodivergent. And then the autism bit took me that bit longer because we're talking the 90s here. Women weren't autistic, girls weren't autistic in the 90s. It wasn't, we just weren't. And I self-identify as quite a few other things because co-occurring conditions are a full thing. Definitely ADHD. I am on the NHS waiting list for ADHD, which in this area is 8.5 years.
What? 8.5 years? That is a madness. That is ridiculous.
Like, I might be 50 before I get medication. Do you know what I mean? When you think of it like that. Could you imagine another medical condition where they were like, maybe just the next decade we'll get to you?
Flipping heck. I mean, if you'd asked me how long, so I would have thought, a ridiculously long wait, like 2 years. It was not even in my head that 8.5 years.
When I got my third, we recognised that you were on the waiting list letter. I thought, you know what, I'm just going to ask. Because, how long is a piece of string? And yeah, 8.5 years. So, crazy. So this is one of the reasons why self-identification is valid, because actual identification is a privilege. And it's a privilege that we've both had, because we had a quick chat about this before this, which was, how were you diagnosed? Now, I did my autism diagnosis privately, and there were lots of different reasons for that. And you did yours privately as well, didn't you?
Yeah.
And one of the many reasons that I did it privately was, one, because I think I had that moment where I was like, I am no longer happy with my self-identification. I want a letter that says it officially, and I'm official, and officially-ness, so I can go show somebody else my letter and go, look, I am. And that came off the back of something that I had to do with my kids, where I was like, I told them, I was like, I am autistic. We are going to communicate autistically over here. And that was just it was completely dismissed. And I was like, all right, the next time that we're interacting, that won't be an option. So I did go privately, and I was lucky enough that because of where I am in the community, that I was able to get good recommendations. And I had a really positive experience of being diagnosed. It was lovely.
Say more about why it was lovely.
Why was it lovely? It was very validating, and the person that I was with asked all the right questions, but then didn't make me feel bad about myself. And I think and if you look at the ICD-11 that we're now using, or the DSM-5, how autism is described in there is pretty harrowing.
Yeah, it's still deficits based, isn't it? Not in any way strengths based.
Yeah, like autism spectrum disorder is characterized by persistent deficits in the ability to initiate and sustain reciprocal social interaction.
Oh, and it's like, hello, have you seen
Autistic people together?
Exactly. Yeah. And that there is reciprocity. Yes. Can I, because there's so much to unpack around here.
Yes.
As it happens, I got a message just this week from someone I used to know through the poetry world, and she's seeking a diagnosis for her son. And she said, there's lots of private providers out there.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know
which one?
Yeah.
Mm.
And she wasn't even asking really for a specific recommendation. But it was more, what will there, and actually I summarised it by saying, and in fact this was ADHD actually, not autism. Although it's interesting, I have an instinct that it's a combined diagnosis that he would be looking for.
And most of us are. It's 70% co-occurring's the stat. So, right. And then you can just assume that they've missed some of work. So, most of us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I said, well, if they refer to giving a strengths-based report or assessment, and would be one of the key ways, actually, because I know it's made such a difference to people when they are given a report that says, oh, so-and-so is really good at this and works well at this and does this. And it's like, it's so important to not effectively give people a piece of paper saying, here's loads of things that we think you're rubbish at.
How you are restrictive and repetitive and inflexible and have patterns of behaviour and interests and activities that are atypical and excessive. There you go. More quotes from the ICD. However, you can rephrase. I've got 4 letters for my diagnosis. So I have a letter that says essentially Nic's autistic, which is sort of useful if you want to if somebody wants proof, I don't know, if you wanted, I think about my kids more for this, but if you wanted to apply for a theatre card or something, do you know what I mean? Something random where you don't want people to have a letter that literally says the insides and outs of your life. So I've got Nic's autistic. I've got a sort of a strengths-based letter where Nic's autistic and they're really interested in this thing, really interested in this thing. And they talk a lot about this. And when they communicate, so on and so forth, that fits within, the criteria, but is written in a slightly different kind of way. And then I have a letter that talks about sort of my needs and what would help me in different situations. And then I have the 4th letter, which is the criteria that I meet in the DSM-5. And when I got my diagnosis, he was like, I do not want you to look at letter 4 for at least 6 months. Don't do it. Don't look at it. You don't need to read it. Give it to your GP. That's for him. It's not for you.
What? This is so enlightened. What year was this then that you were doing?
Oh, this was it was fairly recently that I went and got a proper diagnosis. I want to say 2021. Recently. I mean, it's not that I didn't know, I knew. But there was a moment, and it was an interaction with a professional in my child's life that they were meant to be writing a letter about my children and then wrote about how difficult I was to communicate with. And I was like, the next time we're doing that, we're going to call it discrimination, and I am going to have a letter that will help with that. So I think there was a moment where I had the moment, and then I didn't want to wait because I should really go get that ADHD thing sorted.
It's cruel, actually. The ADHD waiting list. People with ADHD, we don't like to wait around. We want it now. Not in 8.5 dinner. When's dinner? Is it now? 8.5 years till dinner. No. Can I then? So you're prior to that. It sounds like it is the case that you did have what is still, I would think, the actually most prevalent way for late diagnosed adults to realise that they might be neurodivergent was via the diagnoses of your children. Is that right?
Oh, you see, yes, but no. But so my eldest's been diagnosed for 10. So they were diagnosed in 2014, and my husband was diagnosed before them, which is a sort of a weird way around to do it. But we did come to that from a child. So my godson was put through diagnosis, but this is way, way, way back. You're talking nigh on 20 years ago now, give or take. And then, like, at that time I looked, so I was, looking around things, and I was like, oh, that's the husband. But I think that sort of that conversation about different presentations of autism and women being autistic didn't really start to happen until maybe sort of 2010-ish, I want to say. And it wasn't until those conversations started happening more publicly, and I don't want to say in the mainstream, but like in our section of the algorithm, like it wasn't until then where I was like, oh, we're not all Sheldon Cooper, or we're not all the software engineer who also lives in my house, or the physicist, which is my uncle, or the bloke who's really interested in electricity, which was my grandfather. So like I had men around me who were very sort of, they hit that sort of that stereotype. And that's sort of what I thought autism looked like at that time. And it's not. And those conversations sort of started happening, I think, when we went from DSM-4 to DSM-5 in 2013. I think that's really when that properly hit.
Yeah. So,
when were you diagnosed?
2017.
2017.
Although it's interesting because I'm happily child-free, and so my journey would never have come via that route. But actually, many years ago, I think around 2007, I was in a counselling group, and the counsellor started doing some work at a local autism centre. Right. And he began realising, hang on, about himself. But he was a male counsellor, 2007, similarly to how people are not at that point looking at women. They're not looking at men who are doing things like counselling. And at that time, I had long known that there was something, and I kind of looked at mental illness diagnoses. None of them seemed to fit, really. And I was working away with the idea. I was like, I don't recognise people's faces. I think that photographs are lies, and I think that metaphors are lies, which wouldn't be a problem, but my job is being a poet. So, these are not the big issues. Were other big issues, but I didn't realise at the time how they fitted in. Anyway, in chatting with the counsellor together, we kind of went on our own little journey of two, of going, oh, hang on, this thing. We're not going to get diagnosed with this thing. No, we're not going to. I read a book at that time called Women from Another Planet, edited by Gunilla Gerland, and that was one of the earliest autism in women things. And I was like, flipping heck, that is me. And essentially, I made a stand-up show that was intended to ask the question, am I autistic, basically? But you can tell my level of knowledge by the fact that at one point I was going to team up with a psychologist from a university in the hope that I could have electrodes put on my head. So we didn't go down that route in the end. Actually, what he investigated wasn't, can I tell by electrodes whether you are autistic? Is that the right word? Electrodes, like where you have
yeah, the pin things. I'm with you, at least. Yeah.
But he was measuring attention levels, and how much attention children, babies, in fact, paid to things in their environment. So that would have been really interesting. And that set me off looking at the monotropic theories of autism, which I know we mentioned in the first podcast, and we will have to unpack more. But
yes.
The idea of monotropism is a different theory to the theories of lack of theory of mind, and for many of us autistic folk, it's better theory. It's about how we essentially, our brains live in an attention tunnel, and things that come into our attention tunnel, we work with them, and things outside it we don't, because they're boring. That's really that's basic explanation there. Anyway, so I did the show, but I still didn't in any way go for a diagnosis, but I did meet through doing the show. So this was back in about 2009. Lorna Wing and Judy Gould, who were the originators of the idea of the autism spectrum. But at that point, they had gone far beyond spectrum and didn't talk about it as a line, and were not really talking about the spectrum. And I remember Judy, we were interviewed on the radio together, and the presenter asked her something like, well, does Kate, does she seem to fit the features of autism? And she was like, yes. And I was like, that, as far as I'm concerned,
that'll do.
That'll do. Of course, for official purposes, who knew? Actually, it doesn't. If you say someone said in a radio, no, not official. So
I wonder how many people I would have diagnosed if that worked out.
Exactly. Well, and that's another thing, isn't it? And we will.
Oh yeah, we're doing spotting.
We're doing next.
Yeah, identifying each other.
Yeah,
it's a huge thing, isn't it?
Oh, it's because I almost want to say, just don't faff about with the process. Bring them to me. Do I like them? Do they like me? They're autistic. Done. Apparently not a valid process. Don't try that at home. I'm a little aware of time, actually, because I feel like I'm talking. I'm going to wrap up what my actual diagnostic journey was in the end, and then we'll get on to the other topics around self-identification that we're discussing. So, in summary, I then did a PhD in 2014, and I at that point thought, should I, while I'm in a university environment, try and get a diagnosis? But I looked at the leaflet that their disability service had, and it was just all the DSM stuff. The thing that made me think I'm not going down this route now was where it said, one of the criteria is may have difficulty understanding humour. My PhD was in stand-up comedy, and I'm not taking this leaflet to my supervisor. No.
What job do you do? Well,
exactly. So I therefore held it off, but then I was unusually using performance as a means to diagnosis, in that I did another mini show during that PhD, took it to the Autism and the Arts Conference at the University of Kent, and for the first time there met adult autistic women who were performers, who were pretty highly masked, and they were like me. And when I was twiddling with my bracelet, my plastic bracelet, one of them pointed out in the green room, she was like, that's just like the fidget toys that we're giving out to the audience. Why don't you get your diagnosis officially? And I was like, okay. That really galvanised me. Plus, actually, one of the women had done this show about the lost generation of autistic women and how it's a political necessity, really. But as we have said between us, it's also a massive privilege to be able to get that diagnosis and own that identity. So it was all wrapped up in unusual things for me. And I had been through that phase of, but I'm not suffering enough. Well, I'm not suffering. You've got to be suffering. Simon Baron Cohen says you can't get a diagnosis if you're not suffering. One of my friends at the moment actually is stuck there, I would say. She won't get a diagnosis because she's not suffering. I mean, apart from anything else. Anyway, I wouldn't.
But often you don't realise how much you are suffering until you find that validation within yourself and put up boundaries that then stop your suffering. And then you're like, oh, I am not in burnout every 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, pick one. And then you're like, oh, but I'd done that for 15, 20, whatever it was, years.
Absolutely. And that's it. I mean, at the time I was in burnout and not recognizing that as suffering. That was just life, coming in from an event and just then having to spend the next day in bed not speaking. That's just
normal.
Yeah. Or being, routinely sensorily overwhelmed by traveling on trains. Why am I still on trains? Why am I still on trains? And I was just thinking I'm traveling on a train next week. I still haven't get a little sensory pack, try the ear loops, do something. It's like I forget every time that this is a thing. I'm like a goldfish going round in a ball. Anyway, sorry, I'm going to actually make a note. So they said get an official diagnosis. So I went to the NHS and it was really simple and it happened 5 minutes later. No, obviously not. I went to my GP and he said, oh, and I do talk about this story in the show, but for time reasons, I will summarise. He asked me to fill out the self-referral form again, but with fewer notes and more lying. And then he said I would get referred somewhere near York, but they had an 18-month waiting list and they were not known for their expertise in diagnosing women. Oh. And I went to the disability service at the University of Leeds and I spoke to them and hoped things had moved on a bit for them since that leaflet 3 years earlier. And actually they said they knew the diagnostic service in Leeds also did not have particular expertise in women. And at that point, I went back to some of my kind of new contacts that I'd met through the festival and said, where can I go? And they actually said the University of Kent Tizard Centre, which I believe it's connected to the Lorna Wing Centre in London, and I believe it's not still now doing private diagnoses. But that was somewhere I felt comfortable. I'd been going there for comedy conferences as well, and I went down there. I paid £1,000. It was the first time in my life, actually, that I had a spare £1,000. So until I was 42, I wouldn't have had it, and then I did. Yeah. And I also, I had a nice experience. It was longer than I thought it would be. It was 4 hours, and they had previously spoken to my now ex-husband, but then husband, for 2 or 3 hours. And at the end of the appointment, I remember she said, "Yeah, you do meet the criteria. I'll send you a proper report." But she said, "Just be kind to yourself. Be nice to yourself." Yeah. I was like, oh, what does that mean? How will I do that? And I didn't know at that point what a long journey that would actually be, really, because there's be kind to yourself if you think that you have certain needs. And then there's be kind to yourself once you have discovered what those needs actually are.
A lot to unpack. And I'm aware that we've promised shorter podcasts. And maybe we need to revisit some more specific points of this.
Yeah, because it does feel like, it is one of the key questions, isn't it? Certainly, I bet you get asked it a lot, and I get asked it, should I get a diagnosis? Or what's the point of a diagnosis? What are the benefits? And then what are the downsides? And then, it's a process in itself. You go through a process of, if you choose to, you go through a process of diagnosis. That's not a neutral thing. And then you either do or don't get the diagnosis you were seeking. That is also not a neutral thing. And then there's this whole post process that currently there is not support for generally, but there's actually a massive shift in your identity. That's what it is. And like any identity transition in society, some of which we mark, some of which we don't, getting married, becoming an adolescent, having a new job, even, suffering a bereavement,
moving house, loads of things.
Yeah. And some of them we're really good at marking. Actually, at least we do have rituals around, for example, a wedding, and generally around a death with the funeral. But we're really not very good at the process after, which is why so many people say, oh, there was a bereavement and everyone was there was a flurry of activity and then I was just left alone. Feels like don't know.
That we need congratulations that you're neurodivergent cards. I do let you know. I'm always like, congratulations, always.
Yeah. And do you, because I always joke, so I thought I'd get a badge or
or a bear.
Or a bear, indeed.
Just chuck pandas at everyone.
Exactly. Oh, maybe that should be a thing. I've given people presents, and I wish there was but of course, we're going against what's socially accepted, aren't we? Because it would still be generally assumed. Oh.
Well, yeah. And we're not. We are nowhere near on the page that it's all sunshine, daisies, and rainbows, but there is beauty in it. And there's beauty in identification. And there's beauty in that validation as well. Some people really need that. I needed that in the end. I didn't realize how much I needed it until I got it.
Yeah, same. Same. And although, we can briefly talk around self-identification, because obviously we had self-identified before the diagnosis, and then we're both self-identifying around ADHD.
But you have to, don't you? Like, there's no other choice, really. And
actually, maybe what I've learned from the autism diagnosis, so that's official. And actually, at the moment, apart from it's allowed me to accept who I really am, actually. It has meant that I felt able to join groups of other people who are. But I could have anyway. Like, they are welcoming to people who are self-identified. They would have recognised me, but it's helped. It means I've got access to work funding.
Yes.
And that's huge. So these are not small things. And obviously for people who are in the education system, it's huge. But then around, I suppose it's taught me, like with the ADHD, I'm not going to spend, I don't know actually whether I'm not on a waiting list. I'm just like, well, I am ADHD, clearly.
Yeah.
The only reason for me to make that more official might be to access medication if I decide to experiment with that. So again, and I'm aware that's not a small thing, but I do now, having learned from the process, I read a lot about ADHD. I talk to people about it, and I use the strategies and tools, and kind of, I'm not half in, half out. I don't think. I'm like, yeah, this clearly is me.
Yeah, absolutely. And we both drink, well, I drink a lot of coffee. Drink a lot of coffee. Self-medication is also valid.
Exactly. I drink a lot of tea and have one latte in the morning that's absolutely crucial. That it's upsetting if it doesn't happen, but I can't have more than one latte is the thing.
You have it, yeah. I'm drinking all your extra shots.
Yes.
Okay, I think we should leave them with a thought.
Go on.
And leave them hanging with it, and maybe we'll do it on another day. But are we the last generation to not be diagnosed? Does it end here?
Yeah, I want to say yes and no.
Yes and no.
I do pretty much yes, we're the last generation to not be diagnosed, because the rate of realisation is still great. However, well,
or maybe we're the last generation not to self-identify.
Yeah,
in youth.
Yes, in youth.
Yes, in youth.
We're both still meeting people all the time who are clearly neurodivergent but haven't happened.
Oh no.
Bless them. And that's a whole other podcast too. The etiquette of, oh, but you're really autistic. Oh, you don't know you're autistic. Oh, I better not mention it. I'll just have this secret knowledge within my head that becomes a large elephant in my headroom. Anyway, the reason I said yes and no is basically an autism diagnosis is a separate thing from an ADHD diagnosis. These words, even I don't think so I think we will have our concept of neurodivergence, but as to whether that will hold these names in 50 years, I don't think it can, actually. What do you think?
I think we used to diagnose homosexuality 50 years ago. You said 50 years, and that got taken out in 1972 and wasn't in DSM-3. And the thought of diagnosing somebody with a mental health disorder of like homosexuality now in the UK is like, you can't even, there's almost a point where you don't want to say it. Like, you don't even want to say that it happened. And it's just, nobody would think that is acceptable now. And yeah, and maybe that's where we'll go. Maybe we will go with self-identification, and you won't need a diagnosis. It won't be, I don't know. It's a 50 years. I think, however much sometimes we feel very stuck in that I am stuck on an 8-year waiting list. Does that make sense? Our community is moving at pace, and the narrative is moving at pace, and things are changing, even if sometimes in some places it feels glacial. There are areas of our community that are moving really fast and really quickly, and, you know, really communicating with each other, ironically, because we have a supposed communication disorder. And there are areas that are moving more slowly, but they are moving. And it's very difficult to think that we've gone from 10 years ago, it'll be 11 now, where you couldn't actually get an autism and ADHD diagnosis in 2013 in the previous DSMs and criteria, to now we understand that there's a 70% co-occurring, and most people have both. And that's 10 years. And 50 years is quite a long time away to conceptualise.
It is, actually. Yeah, so it's watch this space. Even in 50 days, things could be shifting. I mean, look at AI.
Okay, I think we need to leave them because we've promised half an hour, and all we are doing is making more lists for more podcasts, which can only be a good thing, I think, I hope, dear listener.
In our next podcast, we look at how
does OTDAR work?
How we identify other neurodivergent folk, the OTDAR or the ADAR. What is it? How does it work? Is it really a thing?
Thanks for tuning in to Neurotypicals Don't Juggle Chainsaws. We're so glad you joined us today to explore the fascinating world of neurodivergence with your hosts, me, Nic King.
And me, Kate Fox. If our conversation sparked a thought, a question, or even a smile, don't keep it to yourself. Drop us a line at hello@neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk or visit our website, neurotypicalsdon'tjugglechainsaws.co.uk, to write in. We'd love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider leaving us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast platform.
Until next time, keep embracing the unique ways you juggle the chainsaws of life.